I'm Vicki Hogarth and welcome to Southwest Magazine. I'll be speaking later in this episode with Justin Tinker, chair of the Campobello Island Year-Round Ferry Committee, also known as Accessible Campobello. But first, New Brunswick has been successful at curbing the spread of COVID-19. Joining me today is Chief Medical Officer of New Brunswick, Dr. Jennifer Russell. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Russell.
Thank you, Vicki.
New Brunswick has flattened the curve, but you've said we should expect to see more cases. Where would these cases likely come from?
Well, because there's no community transmission at the moment, the only place they can come from really are imported cases, travel-related cases from outside the province or outside the country.
As we reopen the province, does that change the strategy for testing?
Not really. Our strategy for testing, we have to keep a minimum number of tests going on for symptomatic people to be able to find cases. Obviously we want people to call 811 and if they have any of the two symptoms on the list, that they should get tested, with the exception that children who have the purple toes or purple fingers, that symptom in and of itself, they can get tested just with that symptom alone. So travel, the fact that we're opening things up doesn't necessarily change the testing, other than we have to maintain the level that we have always done. And in fact, if we can increase that, that would be great as well.
Have you considered the idea of population sampling testing or testing asymptomatic individuals to look for spread in places that we're not looking right now?
Well, we have that conversation on and off at the national level to look at what is the benefit of doing that. So we actually are going to do some asymptomatic testing. So right now we are going to be doing asymptomatic testing for pre-op patients. But when we talk to other jurisdictions across the country who have done asymptomatic testing, the return on investment is quite low. In fact, Alberta did about 8,000 pre-op tests in asymptomatic people, and every single one of them came back negative. So you have to look for the cases where you think you're going to find them, and the biggest bang for the buck is really symptomatic people. So we did have some sentinel testing that was being done in hospitals and emergency departments. Those all came back negative as well, and those would have been symptomatic people, but they were in for different reasons other than being worked up for COVID. So in our strategy moving forward, we will continue with the pre-op testing for the time being and keep reassessing, and then we will probably be adopting what PEI has adopted, in that they are testing asymptomatic long-haul truckers.
Do you think there's a possibility that many New Brunswickers had COVID-19 before testing was widely available? There's a lot of thought in different communities that possibly people did have it earlier, before we were even very aware of it.
Yeah, I don't doubt that occurred. I think there's a high likelihood that a few people had been infected without having met the criteria for being tested at that point.
Can you speak a little bit about herd immunity? What does that mean?
Well, herd immunity is when a certain amount of the population has had the infection and has recovered from it. And it does imply that there's a protective component of that when there's a high enough percentage of the population who has had the infection and recovered from it, or has been vaccinated against it. The problem with COVID-19 is that we actually don't know how long the immunity lasts. There are discussions at the national level around getting serological testing available at some point to test for antibodies, which would show if you were immune or not. The problem is we just don't know how long that immunity would last for. Does it last for 3 months? Does it last for 6 months? Does it last for 2 years? Does it last a lifetime? We actually don't know. So we will have to be doing some studies around that at the global level in terms of what that looks like moving forward. There is a question about reinfection or a relapse in somebody who has had it already, and these questions are still not completely answerable at this point in time. And so even if somebody does have a serological test available at some point in time and they do show an immunity, we can't say how long that immunity would last for.
But immunity testing could be something that we're able to test for at some point in the future in the province?
Yeah, exactly. It would be something, but again, you'd have to understand what is the purpose behind that if you really can't say how long that immunity, because we wouldn't want somebody to get a false sense of security about doing things that we would not recommend the average person in the population to do. So we wouldn't want that to influence somebody's behavior in a way that would put them at risk.
Obviously, we're seeing internationally some second waves of COVID-19 coming about in places that thought they had it under control. Where do you have concerns for New Brunswick going forward as we reopen for the possibility of a second wave?
So the reopening plans come with all the caveats around what would happen if we had an increase in cases and what steps we would take. So there's no jurisdiction in this country that doesn't expect more waves. And so the preparations around opening up and how safely we can do that are very important to assure that we have the best chances of success. But we know that it only takes one inopportune case that spreads to a lot of people in a short amount of time to shift everything in terms of what can happen in the future. So we're very cognizant of that, and we're very aware of that, and we take that very seriously. So I think with respect to opening things up and people having a sense of more freedom, I think they do have to understand that there has to be caution around all the things that we're doing right now to prevent a surge in cases. And again, right now, the risk is around travel-related cases. So anybody who is coming into the province must self-isolate for 14 days, and they need to be doing that as safely as possible.
You made the decision the compassionate decision to allow a couple of visitors for palliative care patients. Do you think we'll be doing something similar for nursing home residents in the future, just to help deal with the isolation they've been experiencing?
I hear what you're saying, and this is going to be something that will be reassessed on an ongoing basis. In the meantime, the social development has provided iPads. They bought about 500 iPads, so they've provided those to residents of nursing homes. It's not ideal, it's not perfect, but it is a stopgap from now until we can make changes. But vulnerable populations will continue to be vulnerable throughout this entire pandemic. Again, until there's a vaccine, we're all at risk, but certainly vulnerable populations, institutionalized patients, institutionalized populations, homeless populations, these types of settings will remain vulnerable populations for the entire duration of the pandemic. And so whatever decisions we make have to be made with the balancing of the unintended consequences, the negative impacts, the collateral damage that can happen, the ethics around that, with the risk of having loved ones pass away in a nursing home outbreak. So we have to take all of these things into account when we're making these decisions. They aren't easy decisions, and it's definitely hard on families, and it's definitely hard on residents.
Has there been a silver lining to the pandemic in the sense that it put a spotlight on any changes that we should be making? For instance, with nursing homes, should staff members just be working in one facility?
Well, certainly in other jurisdictions that has played a role in the transmission of COVID-19 to these types of facilities. So it's definitely something that we have looked at and have taken into account in terms of what would happen if we did see a case pop up in a nursing home at this moment in time. In terms of the overall health system, certainly the advances in virtual care have been huge. I mean, these are things that we would have probably liked to have seen put in place many years ago. And the fact that those things are in place right now are really wonderful. I mean, when you think about the way that our population is spread out in terms of rural populations and access and transportation and things like that. So I think we've come a long way in that regard. And I think there's probably other targeted areas that have improved and have had spotlights put on them. And certainly questions around what other improvements could we consider making as we move forward to sustain what we're doing right now with respect to our response to the pandemic, and then what would we want the system to look like after the pandemic is over.
I know you're very busy, so finally I'd just like to know, why do you think New Brunswick has been so successful flattening the curve? What have been the main factors contributing to that?
I think there are multiple factors. From a public health perspective, having really clear and timely communication that the public is able to understand and apply to their own lives and make good decisions around that are really, really useful. Having the support of the government, an all-party cabinet committee. This is unique in Canada, so you don't have the divisiveness of politics getting in the way in terms of distracting from the message to the public. So that unified message is really also very helpful. Having the task force to align the RHAs and the nursing homes has been important. Having strong public health teams in place and good emergency response operations from across GNB, whether it's health and all of our partners to EMO. I think it's an all of government approach really, and to have the the cooperation of the public and the trust and the understanding of the public to be able to get us to where we are, I think they've all played a role in the success, including the border measures.
Thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for all you're doing to keep New Brunswickers safe.
Thank you, Vicki.
That was Chief Medical Officer of New Brunswick, Dr. Jennifer Russell. COVID-19 has had a unique impact on Campobello Island, which relies on a bridge to the U.S. to access the rest of the mainland. Joining me next is Justin Tinker, Chair of Accessible Campobello, to discuss these issues. Justin, how has COVID-19 impacted Campobello Island in terms of restrictions placed at the border?
So the borders have been tightened down for non-essential travel. Anyone who is from the mainland looking to come to Campobello Island, unless it's an essential trip, they're turned away at the border. Island residents can still cross into Maine to pick up the necessities, gas and groceries. They can continue through to St. Stephen, but it certainly has had an impact on the accessibility for Campobello.
Do you think this has drawn more attention to the need for a year-round ferry?
I'd like to think it has. It's certainly been a front burner issue in Ottawa when the ministers of foreign affairs have had to move mountains because we don't have a boat in the water. But we certainly appreciate the fact that they aren't forgetting Campobello, and we're more than an afterthought. So that's certainly appreciated.
I know you recently had a meeting with the Premier and the Minister of Infrastructure, Bill Oliver, the Mayor of Campobello, and Mr. Kuhn. Can you tell me a little bit about what that meeting was about and what the purpose was?
Certainly. So we did sit down Monday morning virtually on a conference call. We spent about an hour and a half talking about the current state of Campobello, how we've got there over the last 20 years, where we'd like to see Campobello 20 years from now. The economic impacts that not having direct connection to the mainland have had, the negative impacts on population numbers for the island, comparing the economies of Campobello to Deer Island to the north or Grand Manan to the south of us. They've both stayed relatively stable over the last 20 years, but Campobello has lost a third of our population, and our market income, which is the independent economic engine, so to speak, of the island. As recently as the turn of the millennium, we were ahead of New Brunswick on average. We were doing quite well. Now we trail behind the provincial average to the tune of about $6,000 per person on the island. So Campobello is still a lovely place to live, lovely place to visit. But if we could imagine how much better it could be with $6,000 per person, more economic activity, that's where the need for the ferry really shines.
We often hear that people who live on Campobello Island don't actually want a ferry. Is there any truth to that? I know that you've talked to people on the island. What are they saying?
Absolutely, and you're right. There are some people on the island who don't see a need for a year-round ferry, and for those people, putting a ferry on year-round wouldn't be of benefit to them individually. And I can respect that. 86% of the island is in support of year-round ferry access, and I would encourage those who are against it individually to look at the broader statistics, to look at the broader facts that for every person who moves off the island, that those who are left, the property taxes are going to have to increase to maintain the existing services. That for every family, especially young family that leaves the island, those are numbers coming out of the school, and the FTE, the teacher allotment for the school goes down because of it. So this is an exercise in long-term viability for Campobello Island, and we can't afford to put it off any longer.
What do you think the ferry would bring to the island that it doesn't have access to now, or things that are difficult to get to the island right now?
So speaking from an immediacy standpoint, the Herring Cove Provincial Park is scheduled to open in a week's time, with no border that tourists can come through to access the island, and no ferry expected in the water until mid to late June. So it's going to be a tourist attraction without any tourists. It'll be great to be able to get out and enjoy the trails and to enjoy a round of golf on the golf course, to enjoy Roosevelt Park. But unfortunately, it's completely inaccessible from the mainland. So the short-term impact is we're going to be, as best as we can in a COVID-19 world, open for business, but the doors are still closed. In a longer-term impact, the accessibility to goods and services is the single largest hurdle facing Campobello Island. Many families who move off the island cite the lack of access to goods and services as a primary reason for leaving the island. And it's no surprise when a satellite dish breaks down in an October gale that the company will tell you, well, we'll send a technician in June when the ferry starts running. Or if you have a leased furnace from Irving or a different fuel provider, if that breaks down in December, again, it's wait until the ferry runs. It stands in the way of building the economy going forward. For instance, there are a lot of things, and some of the things that folks who are skeptical of the need of a ferry, they'll cite, well, we need housing on the island. And that's absolutely true. We need affordable housing, especially. Unfortunately, building that affordable housing is more difficult when the island is only accessible from the mainland 3 months of the year without turning it into an international venture. So the challenge going forward is if we're successful in getting this ferry, all of the projects that have been put off or dismissed because they're simply not viable become viable. As recently as this spring, there was a businessman from St. George who was strongly considering purchasing the local Village Mart, but in an interview with the St. Croix Courier, cited the need to bond trucks coming through and transportation costs through the States as a primary reason for backing out. And that's a shame, because this ferry, as it's conceptualized, would come from Campobello straight to the existing dock in Letite. And that would be a match made in heaven, and it would really invigorate the local economy. So we're looking forward to reversing this continuing trend of decline.
I spoke with Premier Higgs recently about the idea of a year-round ferry, and he says he does see it as a marriage between the provincial and the federal governments in terms of funding. What's your take on that?
It certainly needs to be a shared solution. We have a very unique problem here where it is understood that transportation is historically a provincial portfolio, but the road itself isn't the problem. The body of water itself isn't a problem. It's the imaginary line that cuts Campobello off of the mainland. And so there is absolutely a seat at the table for Ottawa and a place for Ottawa to contribute to, especially the infrastructure costs, to put an adequate dock on Campobello to operate year round through the winter, through the gales in the fall. It needs to be a shared effort. And we're certainly aware of that, and we're encouraged by the words from the province that they're willing to sit down to the table and they're willing to explore this further. And we're looking forward to our member of Parliament, Mr. Williamson, has been a very strong supporter of the need for improved access, and we're looking forward to what he's drumming up in Ottawa.
I know the cost of the ferry is always an issue that comes up when we discuss it. Do you see the ferry running differently in the winter? Is it a different frequency?
It would absolutely need to be variable frequency. The same way as in Grand Manan, during the summer months when tourism season is at its peak, they run 2 vessels on extended schedules. We're not asking for 2 vessels to go back and forth from Campobello Island, but we are asking for 1 vessel to put in full days during the summer. During the winter, that variable frequency can kick in, and we don't expect to have access every hour for 24 hours a day. That's certainly not the case. But there would need to be traffic counts done, and to understand where the peak demands are, to make sure that not only you're being financially responsible and fiscally responsible, but that you're also providing adequate service to the folks on Campobello who deserve direct links to the rest of Canada.
David Kuhn, the New Brunswick Green Party leader, has said that Campobello Islanders are being treated like second-class citizens without a year-round ferry. Do you agree with that statement?
I would absolutely agree with that statement. Mr. Kuhn's been a strong supporter of access for every New Brunswicker. And as he pointed out, we're able to provide access to every other island on both shores. And especially to have an island that is completely cut off from the provincial transportation system isn't right. And it deserves to be rectified, and we're looking forward to that happening.
Do you see this as a national issue that all Canadians should care about?
I think it is. We have a portion of our country who, in order to access the mainland for anything from banking to access specialists, they're being subjected to the laws, the rules, the regulations, and the jurisdiction of a foreign country. That being said, the folks at the border are as every bit understanding as their mandate allows them to be. They sympathize with us. They understand that we really have no other option. But at the end of the day, they have a job to do, and they have to do that job. We have to respect the job that they do as well. So it's certainly a national issue, and it needs the national attention to drive Ottawa to come to the table.
The relationship between Maine and New Brunswick has always been an amicable one, but given that we're in a worldwide pandemic right now, has the border been much more difficult to cross for Islanders? And if so, what do you think that says about the lack of access to the rest of the mainland?
Well, the lack of access, it really comes in the form of having to move policy-based mountains to ensure access for people from Campobello. If you look at the provincial border restrictions, they're very clear, concise. Do not cross the border unless it's absolutely essential. And then in one of the footnotes, it says, unless you're a Campobello resident, in which case none of this applies to you and you don't need to quarantine. And we're thankful for what the provincial government's done to make sure that Islanders can still go to pick up groceries and gasoline without having to quarantine. But it has caused issues, especially with family members from the mainland trying to access family on the island. Through our Facebook page, Accessible Campobello, we've heard really dozens of stories of folks, we lovingly call them PFAs, people from away, or folks who have moved off the island who are trying to get back to care for an elderly parent or a family member and are being turned away at the border. And that's an unfortunate byproduct. Again, we understand the problem as it is, and we appreciate the solution that's put in, but it would be so much simpler, and it would be so much, it would enable so much more if there was a direct link from Campobello to Canada without having to go through a pile of border regulations.
We're about to enter a summer where Premier Higgs is encouraging New Brunswickers to take staycations and discover New Brunswick. With that in mind, what do you think are some things about Campobello Island that are little known about its unique and fascinating history?
One of the most interesting facts about Campobello Island is that it's pivotal to Confederation. With the Fenian raids that had taken place on Campobello, that really drove New Brunswick to join Confederation, and it's a little piece of history that's underserved, of course, with Roosevelt Park being on the island and being the main attraction. Most of the island tourists are American. Growing up, we used to play a little game as we would come up behind a tourist's car and guess the state of the license plate, and whoever had the sharpest eyesight would be able to pick that out. But the Finian raids and what Campobello means to Canada, not just what it means to the States. And that's something that can be discovered year-round and should be accessible year-round.
Because of Roosevelt's history with the island, Campobello is often thought of by people as an American interest destination. With that in mind, are you worried that New Brunswickers might not, especially without a year-round ferry, be discovering the island this year?
I hope that as the story with Campobello not having direct access until those 3 months of summer, as that story continues, my hope is that New Brunswickers will realize what a gem we have in the Bay of Fundy here, and wedged between Deer Island and Grand Manan. And if they can do as much of the Quaddy Loop as they can without crossing international borders, I'd love to see the numbers really come up from our staycationers. That'd be fantastic to see. Statistically, most of the tourists do come from the U.S., but this is an opportunity for all the folks who can't do their getaways to Florida or down south. You can't get a whole lot further south in New Brunswick than Campobello.
Finally, Justin, what are the next steps you hope the government takes to make a year-round ferry happen?
So right now we do have support from the local council. We have support from the provincial government. The next step is getting Ottawa to the table and putting dollars to cents to the project and to get a boat in the water. We're coming up on a summer construction season that there's no reason that this can't be fast-tracked and appropriate dockage put in the water. And we could very easily have a landing finished in the time for the winter season. And I'd love to see that happen. But ultimately, it does mean getting folks to the table and getting them to the table quickly to make that happen.
That was Justin Tinker, Chair of Accessible Campobello. I'm Vicki Hogarth. I'll see you next time on Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO-TV, New Brunswick's only source for independent community television.